start, or do you want power?
So I'll just record the talk and not the questions if it's...
Yeah, whatever works, it's fine with me.
Right, good evening, everyone. The Christchurch NZII is delighted to welcome Associate Professor Jeremy Moses. Jeremy works at University of Canterbury with the Department of Political Science and International Relations. His research interests are in ethics of war and intervention, with a particular focus on realism, pacifism, humanitarianism, and military technology. His publications include the book Sovereignty and Responsibility, and articles in journals including Review of International Studies, International Politics, Cooperation and Conflict, Critical Studies on Security, and State Building and Digital War. Jeremy is here to discuss New Zealand and the lethal autonomous weapons debate. His presentation seeks to explain the complexities of New Zealand's position in the debate of the lethal autonomous weapons, also known as the killer robots. I'll now hand over to Jeremy to give us the overview and give us the presentation. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sandeep, and kia ora everyone else in the room, but also watching from home. I know that you had a talk from my colleague, Amy Fletcher, a couple of weeks back on a related topic. Amy and I are both part of the same Marsden-funded project on dealing with issues surrounding lethal autonomous weapons systems. And there's you can perhaps see the web address there, a website where we put up all of our various activities and events that we've been involved in, and conference papers and publications and so on. So if you're interested in finding out more, please feel free to have a look there. Today, what I wanted to focus on was New Zealand's relationship with the lethal autonomous weapons debate. It might seem at first blush that New Zealand might not have much to do with this, as a relatively small spender on the military in general, but military technology in particular. But it's certainly the case that over the past 12 months, that the Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control, Phil Twyford, has invested a lot of time and energy into forging a New Zealand position on this issue. And so that's what I want to talk about today, both the kind of substance of what they've come up with from a policy perspective, but also some of the limitations and issues with New Zealand's approach to this problem. I guess it's worth spelling out a few acronyms in advance for those of you unfamiliar with some of this terminology. I tend to use the term LAWS, L-A-W-S, lethal autonomous weapons systems. Often people will use the version without lethal, so autonomous weapons systems, and that obviously captures a wider range of weapons technologies that don't necessarily include targeting and killing. So the lethal element really takes it that extra step. It's about those technologies that not only have high levels of autonomy built into them, but are also used for targeting and killing. In Australia, the preferred term is neither of those things. It's RAS, robotics and autonomous systems. And Australia plays an important part in this story for New Zealand, as you might expect, and it's something that I'll come back to a bit later on. So there's a definition here. This is taken from New Zealand's cabinet paper that Twyford brought to cabinet, that was approved and is becoming a part of New Zealand's policy on this issue. They're a bit reluctant to spell out a definition because no definition has been agreed in the discussions at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons talks that have taken place in Geneva on this issue since 2013. States have not been able to agree on exactly what these technologies are, nor on any particular rules to regulate, to govern or to ban the development and proliferation of these kinds of technologies. But we do see reference to definitions like this: weapon systems that once activated can select and engage targets without further human intervention. So, as I've said, this is an issue within international law that has been debated largely since 2010, when certain robotics experts and engineers and some ethicists started to mount a campaign. It was initially known as the International Campaign for Robot Arms Control. That organisation still exists, but has kind of started to come under the banner of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which has come to dominate the activist space since the early 2010s. And as I've also said, in the international legal space, the CCW debates in Geneva, so that's a convention on conventional weapons, regulates different types of weapon systems by consensus of the parties to that convention. No real progress has been made in the talks in Geneva since 2013, and there's a huge amount of frustration around that. Many states now starting to talk more about the possibility of stepping outside that process and coming up with a separate treaty aimed directly at these weapons without requiring the processes of the CCW to be adhered to. And New Zealand is one of those states that is hinting in that direction, as I'll say again in a moment. The other key element, the debate has focused on this question of definition. What do we include as an autonomous weapons system or a lethal autonomous weapons system? It's very hard to find agreement on that because of the variations, different types of technologies, different types of weapons, platforms and systems that could come under this banner. So that basic definition is one problem. The other is the concept of meaningful human control. So a lot of the debate has started to coalesce around this idea that that a key line is drawn depending on how much human control there is over these types of technologies, and that there should be a human involved in any weapons system that undertakes targeting and attack of people, of humans. So that's the sort of background of what's been happening. From the time the issue arose in the early 2000s, New Zealand's position could for the most part be described as being agnostic. Very few statements were made in the first 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, or in the CCW process between 2013 and 2020. New Zealand was not a particularly strident actor in those debates. And certainly there were none indicating any particular stance on the issue prior to 2021. So as I've also said, the appointment of Phil Twyford as Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control in 2020 changed that quite dramatically, and he's taken this on as a bit of a pet issue since coming into that ministerial role. This became clear in a series of set-piece speeches throughout last year, 2021, the first of which was actually here for the Disarmament and Security Centre. It was in the Undercroft, under the library over there, early in 2021. And then there was a speech in Otago specifically about AI and lethal autonomous weapons systems, a speech to the AI Forum. And so Twyford's position started to become clear on this, that New Zealand was wanting to take a leadership role in the debates about laws. And this was tied back to New Zealand's history in relation to nuclear disarmament campaigns in particular. And it was also, I think, tied to the fact that Mary Wareham of Human Rights Watch, who'd been based in Washington for many years prior and had been the lead of the campaign to stop killer robots, returned to New Zealand, may have been in late 2020 or early 2021, and she's had quite a significant influence over Twyford's direction on this, on the laws question. Aside from those speeches throughout 2021 indicating that New Zealand was wanting to take, or that Twyford himself was wanting to convince the government to take a stronger position on this issue, A survey was conducted, which was the result of which were published in July of last year, about New Zealanders' feelings about or knowledge of lethal autonomous weapon systems and the issues surrounding them. The headline that was largely reported out of that was that most respondents, and that's what you can see actually in this figure here, figure 4, support and opposition for the use of autonomous weapon systems in war. That 72% made up of strongly oppose and somewhat oppose of the 2,000 respondents were in that category, that they did not like the idea of these autonomous weapon systems. So this was reported widely as showing that New Zealanders were against the development of these technologies, and so used in that sense to support the minister's argument that New Zealand should be taking a strong position on it. Casting that into a little bit of doubt, you can see in this other figure here, figure 1, awareness of autonomous weapon systems, that the vast majority of those people who said they were opposed to autonomous weapons technologies had in fact never heard of them prior to being surveyed about them. So 68% had not heard anything, weren't aware of these things before they were surveyed. So it's it perhaps undermines that headline finding a bit, but nonetheless, what it illustrates is that there is a kind of spontaneous revulsion, rejection of the idea of these types of weapons being used in war amongst the New Zealand public, but on a broader international level as well. Then when we look at figure 9 here, how do you feel about New Zealand advocating for national and international controls on the development and use of autonomous weapon systems? You can see the pictures are a bit more mixed here, that it's just under 50% if you look at somewhat support and strongly support of people who do support the idea of New Zealand taking a leadership role in relation to these issues. So for many people, they might be horrified by the idea of autonomous weapons, but of those, a number of them perhaps didn't feel it was New Zealand's place to be engaged in that debate. In any case, all of this culminated in on the 30th of November last year with the announcement of Cabinet's commitment to, as you can see here, the international effort to ban and regulate killer robots. And you can see a little bit of the statement made by Minister Twyford at that time, that the evidence suggests fully autonomous weapon systems are not yet being deployed on the battlefield, but the prospect of a future where the decision to take a human life is delegated to machines is abhorrent and inconsistent with New Zealand's interests and values. And so he sets that in the context of New Zealand's broader disarmament strategy that he had launched earlier in the year, and argues that New Zealand is strongly placed to take a leadership role in developing a convention or treaty, preferably within the CCW in Geneva, but outside of that if that proves to be unworkable. So the Cabinet paper itself frames this, the reason for this, why should New Zealand be engaged in this effort in terms of legal, strategic, security and ethical considerations. One of the key statements in the Cabinet paper says our policy settings need to ensure compliance with international law and alignment with Aotearoa New Zealand's values, while preserving the opportunity to pursue legitimate military advantages that some AWS may offer, particularly as defensive systems. So it's at that point that I think we start to get into the more interesting sort of terrain when thinking about, well, on the one hand, Twyford's making these very strong statements about these types of weapon systems being morally unacceptable, ethically questionable, in some instances contrary to New Zealand's interests and values, as he states there, and yet leaving the door open to the development of some of these types of technologies, if that proves to be in New Zealand's interests to pursue that. We can see in the cabinet paper this argument come through most clearly here in section 24. You can see the address where to find the cabinet paper if you're interested in reading the whole thing there. And this states it clearly in a way, but also raises questions about the depth, I guess, of New Zealand's commitment to this issue. So Aotearoa New Zealand also has hard security interests in play, including how to defend against future AWS and protect our personnel and platforms. We also have an interest in maintaining interoperability with our key defence partners, and they are whited out there, so we can't redacted, so we can't see who's referred to there, but the presumption is that it is Australia, the United States, perhaps the United Kingdom, the Five Eyes partners, so we might think Canada as well. As such, our policy settings will need to take into account the prospects of operating alongside and being able to communicate meaningfully with AWS deployed militaries. We therefore have significant interests in actively shaping a framework that makes clear the prohibitions, limits and controls we think are needed to ensure that any pursuit of the benefits of AWS does not come at the expense of fundamental legal and ethical considerations. Okay, so we want the good things. We want to be able to operate, to be able to maintain interoperability with our key defence partners and ally Australia. But we also want to have our legal and ethical concerns taken into account. So it's a bit of a balancing act starting to come into the picture here. What I just want to do now is then to think about, well, what are some of the approaches that the key partners and ally are taking to the development of autonomous weapon systems and lethal autonomous weapon systems? Unsurprisingly, the United States is investing heavily and aggressively in these kinds of technologies across a whole range of different areas. And in some ways, this is summed up in a report that was published in early 2021 by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And you can see there that the co-chairs of this commission are former Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, who's very much a sort of techno-evangelist, and Robert Work, former Undersecretary for the Navy. He's held various positions in the US military establishment over many years, and is known to be very highly committed to the promotion of AI and autonomy in weapons technology in the United States. So the fact that these are the co-chairs suggests that the outcome is in some sense predetermined, that it was going to be very positive about the future of these weapons. So you can, just a couple of key quotes, and these are quotes that were sort of highlighted in the text of the final report itself, that it presents an integrated national strategy to reorganise the government, reorient the nation and rally our closest allies and partners to defend and compete in the coming era of AI accelerated competition and conflict. At the centre of this thinking is of course China. China is mentioned well over 700 times in this report, which is about 750 pages in length. And when you compare, like, I think Russia is mentioned 50 or 60 times, that's the nearest one. So China is the focus here. Competition, conflict, and allies are a really important part of that picture. New Zealand is also mentioned several times in this report as a country that the US will be collaborating on these kinds of technologies. Elsewhere in the report, you can see just below that, a global treaty prohibiting the development, deployment and use of AI-enabled and autonomous weapon systems is not currently in the interest of the US or international security. So this is a fundamentally different position to New Zealand's one. There's an expectation that New Zealand is going to be involved in this technology competition with China on the side of the United States. But clearly, we're not on the same page when it comes to thinking about autonomous weapons technologies. Likewise, in Australia, Australia has, again, a huge range of autonomous weapon systems projects currently underway, many of them in collaboration with the US military and with US military industry. The image you can see in the top left here is of a robotic quadruped produced by a company called Ghost Robotics. And this was being trialled in Australia. I think this was 2019 in military exercises. And there are various contracts in place around that. There is a lot of research going into these issues as well. And my colleague and other postdoc on our Marsden project, Sian Troth, has written and researched extensively on this. This concept of trusted autonomous systems is central to Australian thinking about these issues. You can see that the Trusted Autonomous Systems Research Centre here is hosting a symposium next month called Accelerating Cross-Domain Autonomy. Also taking place as we speak, it's just gotten underway, Exercise Autonomous Warrior, testing new technologies to meet emerging maritime security challenges. We have the development of a project between the Australian government and Boeing called what's now been titled GhostBat. It's formerly known as the Loyal Wingman project. So this is an autonomous unmanned aircraft that's designed to partner with a manned aircraft. So again, a huge project for Australia to be involved in, and one that the US is also heavily connected to. Likewise, these autonomous submarines that you can see on the top right here, produced alongside US company Anduril. And at the bottom, an autonomous vehicle project that is being led by Deakin University. And all of these are, as I've said, also interests of the United States military. So the issue here for New Zealand, of course, is that this is their only ally militarily. The New Zealand Defence Forces expect to be able and are expected to be able to be interoperable with the United States and with Australia, with the United Kingdom and Canada. If we think about, you know, the wider Five Eyes arrangement. And yet, once again, the Australian approach to autonomy is fast, it's aggressive, it's expensive. So it's very hard to see where that leaves New Zealand should Twyford's approach to regulation or banning of autonomous weapon systems come through. It will make interoperability without hypocrisy a very difficult thing, I think, to achieve. The second area that I think is worth noting briefly, I'll wrap up pretty soon, is the question of research and development. So the sort of economic side of things. So you have the military issues, which could be challenging, the economic things could be as well. And once again, you might think, well, you know, New Zealand is unlikely to be developing autonomous technologies that are of relevance to these military applications. But in fact, that's not the case, as I'll show in a moment. You can see here in this section of the cabinet paper, we need to ensure our approach does not inadvertently stifle innovation in AI. So consultation with domestic industry representatives confirms that they do not plan to directly contribute to AWS research and development, but that they require certainty about which activities and partnerships are unacceptable. And then there's mention of dual use goods as well. In this, the word directly is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this term here, in this sentence here, and in this clause, because the thing about these types of military technologies is that many different companies produce very small pieces of technology that are combined to make the final weapon system or platform. Or they might produce a technology that can be attached to a different weapons platform, or that can serve as a platform for the attachment of different types of other technologies, including bringing lethal applications to them. So this is the nature of technology, where you have a lot of small tech firms and startups trying to, you know, produce things that might be useful for industry or for, you know, various other agriculture or other sectors, but which may also have military applications as well. This type of issue raises problems for any state that wants to take a very strong and principled stand against autonomous weapons. The example that I would point to here is of a company was called Rokos. It has recently been purchased by a US company called Drone Deploy. Rokos was a New Zealand based company, and its work has been geared towards the coordination of different robotic systems. You can see here, the part you can see here with Boston Dynamics, MSCent, Data61 and DARPA. This was from Rokos's old website, and they listed these as companies that they were collaborating with. Boston Dynamics is famously the company that produces this quadruped spot, which you may have seen dancing in various videos over the years. MSCent is an Australian company that produces LiDAR, so laser mapping technologies, which are being seen as quite valuable in the field of military technology. Data61 is connected to the CSIRO in Australia, the Commonwealth Scientific Organisation, which is investing hugely, again, in autonomous technologies. And then DARPA, of course, is the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency attached to the US military. So these are the companies and I guess funding sources in the case of DARPA that Rokos was saying previously, whilst they were still New Zealand based and fully New Zealand owned, that they were collaborating with. And all of those companies have connections with military activities and research programs. Data61 and MSCent were joint winners. I think ultimately they ended up second after a kind of playoff round of a DARPA competition called the Subterranean Challenge, which was about navigating tunnel networks using autonomous robotic systems. So I think Rokos was involved in that, but I haven't been able to get an answer from them about that. So yeah, what we see here is that a company that is based in New Zealand is developing technologies that are primarily at this point geared towards industrial applications, but have connections to military funding, would certainly be of interest for military applications. And so it's very likely that Rokos, Drone Deploy and other companies like that coming out of New Zealand will end up being engaged in this kind of work. It's where a lot of the money is, where a lot of the funding is, the startup funding will come from military sources to allow these companies to grow in the first place and conduct the research that they want to conduct. So that leaves us with the question, what then is the best way to proceed? What does all of this mean? There's a few things that I think that are partly already being done, but which perhaps could do with a bit more urgency in order to ensure that they mesh with Twyford's approach. The first is a stock take of current research and development related to lethal autonomous weapons in New Zealand. The second would be the establishment of an interagency working group. And both of these things are noted in the cabinet paper, and the working group is currently being set up at the moment and should be operating soon, which is designed to bring in voices from defence and from industry and so on into the process of developing New Zealand's position on this issue further. I think that there are some bigger problems afoot, though. Primarily, if New Zealand wants to claim to be a leader on ethics and international law, I can't see how that can be achieved without significant disruption to its military ties, so to the Australian alliance and to its relations with the United States and the UK, military forces in particular, and to its economic interests in the tech sector. So what worries me is that I feel like at the moment that there's almost an idea that this can be a cost-free sort of posturing on the international stage, that we can go out and, we have this great history of disarmament activism and be a leader and so on. But there are these quite significant obstacles in the way of actually make a difference to New Zealand. This is not something that comes without any change or without any costs attached to it. And I think that at the moment, those costs have not been grappled with. The policy looks very appealing, I think, to the public and perhaps to those in government. I think perhaps people in defence have not yet fully grasped the potential implications of New Zealand taking a very strong stand on this. So ethical posturing without substantive willingness to sacrifice interests will make for weak regulation of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I would also be concerned that the bigger picture is that that type of statement making without substance undermines disarmament efforts more broadly. That if states are wanting to do these things just to look good on the international stage but aren't willing to make sacrifices, this is not helpful from a broader disarmament perspective or from an international legal perspective. So that's where we are now. I'll leave it at that and happy to answer any questions that people have.
Thank you, Chair.